Let me ask you a question. Why do we eat? Well, the simple answer that you're probably thinking of, I mean, aside from the fact that we get pleasure from food, it tastes pretty good sometimes, is that that's where we get our energy from. Sure, well, let me ask you another question then. Why do we breathe? Well, we know we breathe because we need oxygen, and we know that if we don't get that oxygen, then we're going to die. But why is that? Well, it actually turns out that these two questions, why we need to eat and why we need to breathe, are intrinsically related. So let's think about this for a moment. So let's imagine what happens when you don't eat. Pretend you're at sea with no resources. Or think about what happens if you're under lower oxygen conditions. So imagine your altitude. Imagine you're up at the top of Everest, where every breath you take has only a third of the oxygen you would take at sea level. What do you think is going to happen to you? Well, in both those situations, there are a lot of factors working against you, but the two most important ones here, firstly, not having any food, or secondly, having reduced oxygen, well, ultimately, what happens there is eventually you reach a point of extreme fatigue, of incredible physical exhaustion, and a major mental slowdown. And what this tells you is a couple of really important things. That in the absence of food and that in the absence of oxygen, you cannot sustain activity. And what it also tells you is that those two things are intricately involved in energy transfer. Why? Well, because that's just how your cells work. So as it turns out, energy is most simply defined as the capacity to do work. And cells are working all the time. They are constantly producing new components, they are building proteins, they are building membrane, they are having to transport materials from point A to point B, and they are running thousands of chemical reactions every single second. Well, all of that is cellular work, and all of that work requires energy. If the cell doesn't get that energy, then the cell cannot function. Importantly, cells have evolved to rely on an all-purpose molecule for their energy needs. This molecule is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, and in an earlier video we described how the region of the molecule that contains those three phosphate groups is, relatively speaking, unstable. I like to think of it as like a chemical spring storing energy, and what happens when we hydrolyze that ATP molecule, when we break off one of those phosphate groups, is it releases energy. And that's the energy that the cell uses to do its work. So the question is then, if cells need to do a lot of work, and if that work requires energy, and that energy comes in the form of ATP, well, how do the cells generate or obtain ATP? If you think about it, in our case, we don't consume ATP, or not in any meaningful amount. Instead, what cells have to do is they have to transfer the energy from the organic molecules, the food that we eat, and transfer it into the bonds of the ATP molecule. And they do this through the process we call cellular respiration. Nearly all cells, whether prokaryote or eukaryote, undertake cellular respiration. For this video, we're just going to focus on eukaryotes. And the first thing we need to be aware of is that absolutely indispensable for this process is oxygen. This is because eukaryote cellular respiration, and for the record, most prokaryote cellular respiration, is aerobic, meaning it is oxygen requiring. This is why we breathe, and why most cells across all domains of life require oxygen to survive. we look at this process in a little more detail, we actually make some connections here. How specifically does cellular respiration bring together what we eat with the oxygen we breathe to produce ATP? To understand this, we have to appreciate that cellular respiration consists of organic molecules entering cells and then undergoing a series of chemical reactions through which its bonds are progressively broken. As a result of which, some of its electrons are transferred to specialized molecules that will then use those electrons at the end of the process to generate ATP. Now, in chemical terms, reactions that result in the transfer of electrons are what we refer to as reduction, oxidation, or redox reactions. And when an atom or compound loses electrons, we describe that as oxidation. We say it is oxidized. This oxidation reaction is always paired with a reduction reaction. There, the atom or compound that gains those electrons is said to be reduced. And in cellular respiration, the source of those electrons is the organic molecules from the food we consume. In other words, it's all about oxidizing organic molecules, for example glucose, to obtain their electrons. Now, an important point here is that when we say organic molecules are oxidized, what we mean is that the electrons are transferred in the form of hydrogen atoms, because of course a hydrogen atom is made up of a single proton and a single electron. Ultimately, the organic molecule will be converted to carbon dioxide. This is the carbon dioxide that we breathe out. And those electrons or hydrogen atoms will be transferred through a series of carriers where they will ultimately be bonded to oxygen, the oxygen we breathe in, resulting in the formation of water. We can summarize this whole process with an equation, but as we're going to explore in a later video, what's really important is that the electrons in organic molecules have high potential energy. And as they are transferred to oxygen, they release some of this energy, which our cells capture in ATP. So, let's explore this process using glucose as our starting organic molecule. So if we look at the process of cellular respiration, what we see is that it actually occurs in 3 stages. Glycolysis, which is the subject of this video, pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle, and then we finish off with something called the electron transport chain. Now, glycolysis takes place in the cytosol, and it involves a wonderful series of reactions, the details of which, if you're into them, well, that's pretty cool. But for me, what's most important is to actually think about 3 things. Firstly, what is happening to this molecule of glucose? Why is it happening? And then what do we get out at the end of the process? Now, if you want to look at all the molecular transformations and all the enzymes that do this, you can find those details in any textbook. What I want us to do is look at glycolysis with those 3 questions in mind. So let's start with a definition. Well, glycolysis literally means sugar splitting. And during this process, what we're going to see are a few key events occurring to a 6-carbon molecule of glucose. We're going to see it being split into 2 3-carbon molecules that we'll just call G3P. We're going to see some of its electrons get stripped away, so in other words, it's going to be oxidized. And we're going to see it ultimately rearranged into 2 molecules of pyruvate, molecule that then actually goes on to a later stage of cellular respiration. So let's take a closer look at this process. Typically, we describe glycolysis as occurring in 10 steps. What I want you to note, though, is that the first 5 of these are referred to as the energy investment phase. Now, during this process, what we're going to see is a molecule of glucose is going to undergo a series of reactions, a series of molecular rearrangements that results in the production of 2 molecules of G3P. Now, why do we call this the energy investment phase? Well, take a look at the very first step in this phase and notice how a phosphate group is transferred from an ATP molecule to glucose. Then take a look at the third step and notice that we see the same thing. In other words, we've used up 2 ATP molecules here. Now, why do we do this? Well, this happens because it makes the molecule more reactive. By investing a little energy, by investing 2 ATP, what we're able to do is make this molecule sufficiently unstable that we can firstly split our sugar into 2, and secondly, prime it so that we can start stripping away its electrons. And once we start doing that, we then move into the second half of the process, what we call the energy payoff phase. During this phase, each molecule of G3P is going to undergo a sequence of reactions that results in it being molecularly rearranged and producing pyruvate. But there are a number of very important events occurring during this phase that explain why we call it energy payoff. Take a look at the first couple of steps in this process. Notice how an enzyme brings together our G3P molecule, a free phosphate, and a very important molecule called nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, or for our purposes, we're just going to call it NAD. NAD is an electron carrier. In other words, this is the molecule to which the electrons from G3P are going to be transferred. So in other words then, G3P is oxidized, and this results in the transfer of 2 electrons from G3P to NAD. What this means is that in turn, NAD becomes reduced to what we now call NADH, and as it turns out, we get a proton as well. That NADH is then going to take off to a later stage of cellular respiration where we'll see the payoff later on. Now, as it turns out, the transfer of those electrons actually releases enough energy to attach that free phosphate to our molecule and then very promptly transfer it to adenine diphosphate, or ADP. What does that produce? Well, that produces an ATP molecule. If we then skip to the end of the payoff phase, we see that we've still got 1 remaining phosphate attached to the molecule. That now is going to be transferred to another molecule of ADP, ultimately giving us another ATP. And our final molecule of the process, pyruvate. Now in a eukaryote, that pyruvate is going to be transported into the mitochondria for the next stage of respiration. But a very important point to note here is that, remember, this is occurring twice. For each starting molecule of glucose, we got 2 molecules of G3P at the end of that energy investment phase. Well, each G3P molecule is going to go through the same series of reactions during energy payoff. So here we are. Here's our summary table of glycolysis. So what did we actually see happen? Well, we started with 1 molecule of glucose, which we invested 2 molecules of ATP into. And what do we get out at the end? Well, at the end of the process, we get 2 pyruvates. We get 2 molecules of NADH, this high energy electron carrier, and we also got 4 molecules of ATP. But because we put 2 in at the start, we get a net gain of actually 2. Now, that maybe doesn't sound like a lot of energy. 1 molecule of glucose, we've got 2 ATPs. That's not going to power an awful lot of cellular work. But don't forget, those high energy electron carriers, the NADH, we're going to see those right at the final part, the final stage of cellular respiration, where they're going to give us a much bigger energy payoff. And also don't forget, we still have 2 molecules of pyruvate. And in fact, at this point, most of the potential energy from that glucose molecule is actually in those pyruvate. The problem is we've got to get at it. And how do we do that? Well, there we move on to the next stage of cellular respiration, which is pyruvate oxidation. But for now, this is glycolysis. Pretty cool.